The Vikings' true navigation methods. A journey through ancient seas. Settle in, close your eyes, and let me take you on a gentle voyage across time to an age when the northern seas were vast and mysterious, when wooden ships carved through cold waters beneath endless skies, and when the Vikings mastered the art of finding their way across horizons that seemed to stretch into eternity. The awakening dawn. Imagine, if you will, a morning in the year 895. The sky above the Norwegian fjord is painted in soft shades of pearl and rose. Mist rises from the dark water like breath from the earth itself. On the rocky shore, a longship rests its dragon-head prow pointing toward the open sea, as if already dreaming of distant lands. A man stands at the water's edge. His name is Gunnar, and he is a navigator, though that word would have meant something different to him than it does to us. He carries no compass, no charts marked with lines of latitude and longitude, no instruments of brass and glass. Yet in his mind, he holds an entire ocean, mapped not in ink but in memory, sensation, and the accumulated wisdom of generations. Gunnar runs his weathered hand along the ship's side. The wood is smooth from years of contact with salt water, worn by countless journeys to Iceland, to the Faroe Islands, perhaps even to the legendary lands his grandfather spoke of, places so far west that the sun seemed to set into an endless green horizon. Today, he will teach his son, Eric, the ways of the sea. Not through books or formal instruction, but through observation, through story, through the patient transmission of knowledge that has kept his people alive on the cold waters of the North Atlantic for longer than anyone can remember. The language of the sky. As the crew prepares the ship, loading provisions of dried fish, checking the integrity of the woolen sail, ensuring the oars are secure in their ports, Gunnar takes Eric to a small rise overlooking the fjord. Before we speak of sailing, Gunnar says quietly, his voice barely louder than the whisper of wind through the pine trees. We must speak of the sky, for the sky is our first and truest guide. He points upward. Though the sun has not yet fully risen, our people have always known that the heavens turn around a single point, what we call the world nail. The place where the sky seems fixed while all else wheels around it. What Gunnar describes, in his own language and understanding, is what we would call Polaris, the North Star. But for the Vikings, this celestial beacon held a deeper significance. It was more than a navigational reference point. It was a cosmic anchor, the pivot around which the entire universe turned. At night, Gunnar continues, when the clouds part and the stars emerge, you must first find the world nail. It lies at the end of the Little Bear constellation, which never sets below our horizon in these northern lands. Once you know where it sits, you know which direction is north, and from that all other directions become clear. But Eric, being young and practical, asks the obvious question. What about when clouds hide the stars? What about the many nights when we cannot see the sky at all? Gunnar smiles. This is the question every young navigator must ask, and the answer, the full answer, takes a lifetime to truly understand. The solar knowledge. As the sun climbs higher, painting the fjord in shades of amber and gold, Gunnar begins to explain the second great pillar of Viking navigation, the systematic observation of the Sunday. The sun, he says, follows a path across the sky that changes with the seasons. In summer, it rides high and barely sets, giving us the long days of light. In winter, it skims low along the southern horizon, leaving us in darkness for much of the day. But in its movement, there is pattern. In its pattern, there is knowledge. And in that knowledge, there is the way across the sea. The Vikings, though they left no written treatises on astronomy, were keen observers of solar motion. They understood something fundamental. At their northern latitudes, the sun's path across the sky provided reliable directional information, especially during the summer months when most oceanic voyages took place. Gunnar explains how, at noon, the sun reaches its highest point in the sky, directly south. If you watch the shadow cast by the mast, or by a gnomon, a simple stick held upright. The shadow at midday points true north. It is the shortest shadow of the day, and it never lies. But navigation by sun involves more than just finding noon. The Vikings developed a sophisticated understanding of solar azimuths, the sun's position along the horizon at sunrise and sunset. These positions shifted throughout the year in predictable ways. In midsummer, Gunnar tells his son, the sun rises far to the northeast and sets far to the northwest, spending much of its time in the northern half of the sky. In midwinter, it rises in the southeast and sets in the southwest, staying close to the southern horizon. Between these times, it moves in a rhythm as reliable as your heartbeat. This knowledge allowed Viking navigators to maintain a course even when landmarks were out of sight. By noting where the sun rose in the morning and checking its position throughout the day, they could keep their ship oriented along a consistent latitude, sailing east or west while maintaining their north-south position. The shadowboard's secret. As the morning advances and the crew finishes their preparations, Gunnar brings Eric aboard the ship. In the navigator's space, a small area near the stern where the helmsman stands at the side-mounted steering oar, Gunnar reveals a simple wooden disc, carefully wrapped in oiled cloth. This, he says, unwrapping it with care, is what my father gave me, and what his father gave him. Some call it a bearing dial, others a sun compass. I think of it simply as the shadow board. The object is a round disc of wood, perhaps the width of 2 hands across, with a small vertical pin or gnomon rising from its center. Around the edge, notches have been carved, dividing the circle into sections. Lines radiate from the center, and at certain points along these lines, marks have been made, some shallow, some deeper. The shadow board was not a compass in the magnetic sense, but rather a device for tracking the sun's shadow throughout the day, allowing navigators to maintain a consistent course along a particular latitude. When we sailed to Iceland last summer, Gunnar explains, his voice taking on the rhythm of a story told many times before, I placed this board level on the ship each day at dawn. The gnomon cast its shadow across the surface, and I marked where that shadow fell. Then, throughout the day, I watched as the shadow grew shorter toward noon, then longer again toward evening. The true genius of the shadow board lay in its use over multiple days on the same latitude. If a navigator marked the shadow's tip at regular intervals during a westward journey, these marks would form an arc across the board. On subsequent days, if the ship had drifted north or south, the shadow's path would differ, falling either inside or outside the previous day's arc. By keeping the shadow on the same path each day, Gunnar says, we keep the ship on the same latitude. We follow an invisible line across the ocean, as straight as if it were drawn by the gods themselves. This technique, known as latitude sailing, was fundamental to Viking navigation. Rather than plotting a course as a series of angular bearings, they would sail north or south until reaching the latitude of their destination, then turn east or west and maintain that latitude until landfall. To sail from Norway to Iceland, for instance, a navigator might sail west from Bergen, keeping the North Star at a constant height above the horizon each night and the sun's noon shadow at a constant length each day. This would carry the ship along the 60th parallel, directly to the southern coast of Iceland. The reading of waves. As the longship pushes away from shore, the crew rowing in synchronized rhythm, Gunnar directs Eric's attention downward, to the water itself. The sea has a language, he says softly, written in the patterns of waves, in the color of the water, in the way the surface moves and changes. Learning to read this language is as important as reading the sky. The North Atlantic is a realm of complex water movement. Currents flow in vast gyres, driven by wind and the rotation of the earth. Swells, the long, rolling waves generated by distant storms, march across the ocean in relatively straight lines, their direction remaining consistent even as local wind patterns shift. See how the water moves in 2 ways at once? Gunnar points to the surface, where smaller wind-driven waves overlay broader, deeper undulations. The small waves change with each breath of wind, dancing and shifting. But the great swells beneath them, those come from far away, and they keep their direction for days. These deep waves are born from storms we cannot see, in places we may never visit, but they remember where they came from, and they can help us remember where we are going. This observation of wave patterns, technically called swell propagation analysis in modern terminology, was a crucial navigational tool. By feeling the ship's motion and watching the angle at which swells approach the hull, an experienced navigator could maintain a bearing even in fog or overcast conditions when sun and stars were hidden. The Vikings developed an almost tactile relationship with the sea. They could sense, through the ship's movement, the difference between swells from different directions. They learned to recognize the characteristic wave patterns near land, how swells refract around islands, how waves reflect off underwater shoals, how the sea's texture changes as water depth decreases. Sometimes, Gunnar says, his voice barely audible over the splash of oars, when the fog is thick and we cannot see more than a ship's length ahead, I stand here with my eyes closed. I feel the ship rise and fall. I sense the rhythm of the water beneath us. And in that rhythm, I can feel which way we are moving, whether we are still on course or have drifted with the current. This is not mysticism, though it might sound like it. This is the accumulated wisdom of a seafaring culture that spent generations learning to interpret subtle environmental cues. Modern research in traditional Polynesian navigation has revealed similar techniques. Navigators who could detect land beyond the horizon by reading wave patterns, who could maintain courses in total darkness by feeling the orientation of ocean swells against the hull. The Sermon of Seabirds. 2 days into the journey, as the Norwegian coast has dwindled to a thin gray line behind them and the open Atlantic stretches ahead, Gunnar begins teaching Eric about another vital source of navigational information. Birds. The birds are messengers, he says, watching a gannet dive into the sea some distance from the ship. They tell us where land lies, how far we have come, and how far we have yet to go. Different seabird species have different ranges from land, and Viking navigators learned to recognize these distinctions with precision. Some birds never venture far from shore. Their presence meant land was near. Others range widely across the open ocean but return to land each evening to roost. By watching their flight direction in the afternoon, a navigator could determine the bearing to the nearest coast. The gulls and cormorants stay close to home, Gunnar explains. If you see them, you know land is within a day's sail, perhaps less. The puffins range farther, but even they must return to their cliffside burrows. In the evening, watch which way they fly, that is the direction of land. The most famous example of bird-assisted navigation in Viking culture is the story of Floki Vilgerðarsson, nicknamed Raven Floki, who used ravens to help him find Iceland. According to the saga, Floki brought 3 ravens with him on his voyage. When released, the first raven flew back toward Norway. They had not sailed far enough. The second flew straight up and returned to the ship. They were too far from any land. The third raven flew forward and did not return. It had found land ahead, guiding Floki toward Iceland's coast. Whether or not this story is literally true, it reflects a genuine navigational practice. Ravens, being land birds, would naturally fly toward the nearest shore when released at sea. By bringing such birds and releasing them periodically, navigators could get a bearing toward land even when none was visible. But you must know the birds, Gunnar cautions. You must know their habits, their ranges, their behaviors. A tern flying over deep ocean tells you nothing about land. They are creatures of the open sea. But a land bird, exhausted, landing on your mast that tells you a storm has blown it far from shore. And if you follow the direction from which it came, you may find unexpected land. The color of distant waters. As they sail onward, the water around them begins to change. The deep blue-black of the open Atlantic gives way to slightly different hues, here a patch of green, there a stretch of lighter blue. The sea speaks in colors, Gunnar tells Eric, gesturing at the shifting palette surrounding them. Each color tells us what lies beneath and what lies ahead. The Vikings, like many seafaring peoples, became expert at reading watercolor as an indicator of depth and seafloor composition. Deep oceanic water appears dark blue or black. As water becomes shallower, it takes on lighter shades: blue-green over sand, darker green over beds of kelp, brownish or turbid over mud. These color changes could indicate the presence of underwater banks or shoals, hazards to navigation, but also indicators of position. The Viking Age sailors learned the characteristic watercolors of different regions. The pale green-blue over the shallow banks west of Ireland, the darker waters of the Norwegian Trench, the distinctive hue of the sea near Iceland, where glacial meltwater mixed with Atlantic currents. Sometimes, Gunnar says, you can see land before you see land. Do you understand? Eric looks puzzled and Gunnar smiles. When clouds sit over an island, they reflect the colors beneath them. Ice fields create a bright reflection on the bottom of clouds. We call it ice blink. Green land, with its grass and moss, casts a green tinge. Dark rock creates a dark reflection. A skilled navigator watches the sky as much as the sea, reading the reflected colors, seeing the shadow of lands that lie beyond the horizon. This phenomenon, known as cloud reading or sky color analysis, was documented among Arctic peoples and appears in some Viking navigational lore. While it requires very specific atmospheric conditions, low clouds at the right height and angle, it could extend the effective range of vision considerably, allowing navigators to detect land from distances of 50 kilometers or more. The myth and mystery of the sunstone. On the fourth evening, as the sun hovers above the western horizon in the prolonged twilight of northern summer, Gunnar sits with Eric near the mast. The wind has dropped, and the sail hangs slack. The crew rests at their oars, and the ship rocks gently on the long swells. You have heard, Gunnar says quietly, the stories of the Solarstein, the sunstone. Men in the drinking halls speak of it as if it were magic, a crystal that shows the sun even when clouds hide it from view. Eric nods eagerly. Every young sailor has heard such tales of a mysterious stone that glows or changes when pointed toward the hidden sun, allowing navigation even in the thickest fog or under complete overcast. I will tell you what my father told me, Gunnar continues, his voice taking on the cadence of a storyteller. The sunstone is real, but it is not magic. It is a stone calcite, we call it, though I have also heard of other stones with similar properties. It is clear like ice, and when you look through it at the sky, something strange happens. What Gunnar describes, in his own understanding, is the phenomenon of light polarization. When sunlight passes through Earth's atmosphere, it becomes partially polarized, meaning the light waves align in particular directions. This polarization is strongest in a band across the sky perpendicular to the sun's position. Certain crystals, particularly calcite, Iceland spar, have the property of double refraction. When you look through such a crystal, you see two images, but here's the crucial detail. The intensity of these two images changes depending on how the crystal is oriented relative to polarized light. My father showed me how to use such a stone, Gunnar says. You hold it up and look through it at different parts of the sky, rotating it as you do. In one position, one of the two images becomes darker, while the other becomes brighter. You check different portions of the sky, and you note where the dividing line between bright and dark is strongest. That line runs perpendicular to the sun's position, even when the sun is hidden by clouds. Even when it is just below the horizon at twilight or dawn, you can find this line, and from it you can determine where the sun is or where it will rise, or where it has set. Modern research has confirmed that this technique could work. Studies using calcite crystals and artificial sky polarization have shown that navigators could determine solar direction to within a few degrees even under complete overcast, provided they knew what to look for and had experience with the technique. However, Gunnar is honest about the limitations. It is not easy, he says. You must practice. You must understand what you are seeing. And it only works in certain conditions. The stone cannot find the sun through a storm, through heavy rain, through darkness itself. It is a tool, like any other tool, useful in skilled hands, but not the magic that young sailors imagine. The historical evidence for Viking sunstone use is tantalizing but not conclusive. A piece of calcite was found with navigational instruments on an Elizabethan ship that wrecked in 1592, suggesting such crystals were used for navigation in northern European waters. Icelandic sagas mention Solarstein in contexts that suggest navigational use. But no definitively Viking-age sunstone has been found in an archaeological context clearly associated with navigation. Whether we use such stones or not, Gunnar concludes, the principle is sound. There are many ways to find direction, many tools and techniques. The best navigator knows them all, and uses whichever is most suited to the moment. The memory of routes. On the 6th day of the voyage, land appears on the northern horizon, the Shetland Islands, exactly where Gunnar predicted they would be. The crew cheers, and Eric looks at his father with newfound respect. But Gunnar simply nods, as if the appearance of land was the most natural thing in the world. That evening, anchored in a sheltered bay, Gunnar reveals another crucial aspect of Viking navigation: the vast mental maps that experienced navigators carried with them. When I learned to sail this route, he tells Eric, my father did not draw me a map on parchment. Instead, he told me stories. He described every landmark, every island, every distinctive feature along the way. He told me how many days sail between each point, what the wind usually does in different seasons, where the currents run strong, where fresh water can be found, where harbors offer shelter. This oral transmission of navigational knowledge was fundamental to Viking seafaring culture. They created mental maps of extraordinary complexity, encoded in verse and narrative to aid memory. These oral descriptions, called sailing directions or routiers by later medieval sailors, specified courses in terms of observable features. From Bergen to Shetland, Gunnar recites, his voice falling into a rhythmic pattern. Sail west for 3 days' sail with good wind. Keep the North Star on your right shoulder at night. When you see the cliffs that look like an old man's face, you are close. Turn north until you see the inlet with the red rocks. These directions seem simple, even poetic, but they encode practical navigational information. 3 days' sail is a measure of both distance and expected travel time. The North Star on your right shoulder means maintaining a westward course with a slight southern component. The distinctive cliffs provide a recognition point, and the final instruction gives a bearing and a specific landmark for the destination. The Vikings developed extensive sailing directions for all their major routes, from Norway to Iceland, from Iceland to Greenland, from Denmark to England, from Sweden through the Russian river systems. These routes were memorized, practiced, and passed down through generations of navigators. But you must remember, Gunnar says, his tone becoming more serious, that the sea changes, storms shift the sandbanks, rocks that once stood above water may be worn down by waves, new harbors may form, old ones may silt up. A good navigator learns the old knowledge, but also watches for changes, notes them, and passes that updated knowledge on. This adaptive learning was crucial. Unlike written maps, which could become outdated, oral traditions allowed for constant updating and refinement. Each successful voyage added to the collective knowledge pool. Each observed change was incorporated into the sailing directions. Each generation refined the understanding of those who came before. The art of dead reckoning. As the journey continues westward from Shetland toward the Faroe Islands, Gunnar introduces Eric to what he calls reckoning the path, what modern sailors call dead reckoning. Navigation, Gunnar explains, is not just knowing where you are going. It is also knowing where you are at every moment, even in the middle of the ocean with no land in sight. Dead reckoning is the practice of calculating one's current position based on course and speed from a known previous position. For the Vikings, this meant keeping a mental or physical log of the ship's progress. Every day, Gunnar says, I note our progress. I observe how fast we are moving through the water. You can tell by watching how quickly foam or debris passes along the hull, or by noting landmarks on shore when we're near land. I note the direction we've been sailing, checked against sun and stars. I estimate how far we've come. Perhaps 24,000 paces in a day of good wind. Perhaps 12,000 in a day of poor wind and much rowing. The Vikings had no log line or chip log devices later sailors used to measure speed through the water. Instead, they relied on experience and observation. An experienced navigator could estimate speed remarkably accurately by watching the water flow past the ship, by noting the sound of the bow wave, by feeling the ship's response to wind and oar. In your mind, Gunnar continues, you carry a picture of where you have been and where you are. If we sailed west for 2 days at good speed, then north for 1 day at slower speed, then west again for half a day, I know roughly where we are on the sea, even if I cannot see land. I know we have covered this much distance in this direction, and so we must be approximately here. This mental dead reckoning, combined with periodic position checks using celestial observations and landmark recognition, allowed Viking navigators to maintain awareness of their position with surprising accuracy. Studies of traditional Pacific Island navigators have shown that experienced practitioners of dead reckoning can track their position over hundreds of kilometers of open ocean travel, arriving at small island targets with remarkable consistency. But you must account for drift, Gunnar warns. The currents push the ship sideways. Even as we sail forward, the wind creates leeway. The ship slides a bit sideways through the water when sailing at an angle to the wind. You must learn to feel these forces, to estimate how much they move you from your intended path, and to adjust accordingly. The wisdom of the deep. On the 10th day, the Faroe Islands fade behind them, and the ship pushes out into the open Atlantic. They are now committed to the Iceland, crossing the longest stretch of the voyage, where they will be out of sight of land for several days. This is when Gunnar teaches Eric about one of the most sophisticated aspects of Viking navigation, the reading of deep ocean indicators. The ocean is not empty, Gunnar says, trailing his hand in the water. It is full of signs for those who know how to read them. He points to a small piece of seaweed floating past the hull. Kelp and rockweed do not grow in deep water. They cling to rocks in shallow areas or near shore. When you see such plants far from land, it means they have been torn loose by a storm or carried by a current. By noting what type of weed it is and what direction it is drifting, you can learn about currents and about lands that lie in that direction. The Vikings also observed the color and clarity of the water. Atlantic water has distinctive characteristics. The Gulf Stream is warm and deep blue. Arctic waters are cold and often contain ice crystals or glacial silt. Coastal waters carry sediment and organic material. See how the water here is clear blue? Gunnar gestures at the sea around them. This is the deep ocean water. If it turns greener and more turbid, we are approaching the shelf waters around Iceland. If it becomes very cold and we begin to see ice, we have drifted too far north. Even the behavior of fish provided navigational clues. Certain species stayed close to land. Their presence suggested proximity to shore even when land was not visible. Fishermen's knowledge and navigators' knowledge overlapped extensively in Viking culture. Many navigators were also fishermen, and they used their understanding of where different fish were found to estimate their position at sea. My grandfather, Gunnar says, his voice soft with memory, told me of a time when his ship was caught in fog for 3 days south of Iceland. They could see nothing, but they kept pulling up cod on their lines, good fat cod. He knew that such cod were found on the banks south of Iceland, and so he knew they were not far from their destination. He sailed north slowly, sounding the depth as he went, until the fog lifted and they saw land ahead. This practice of lowering a weighted line to measure water depth was crucial in Viking navigation, especially when approaching land in poor visibility. The Vikings used simple lead weights attached to long lines marked at regular intervals. By bringing up the weight, they could also examine what was on the seafloor: sand, mud, gravel, rock, which gave additional clues about location. Each place has its own signature, Gunnar explains. The approaches to Bergen have sand mixed with shell fragments. The banks west of Scotland have rough gravel. The waters near Iceland have dark volcanic sand. By feeling the bottom, you can know where you are. The test of the storm. On the 13th day, the weather changes. The sky darkens, the wind rises from the southwest, and the seas begin to build. Within hours, the longship is battling heavy swells and driving rain. This is the true test of navigation, maintaining orientation and direction, when all the usual references are obscured, when survival itself becomes the immediate concern. Gunnar takes the steering oar while the crew reefs the sail, reducing its area to prevent the ship from being overpowered. Eric clings to the mast, watching his father work. Even in these conditions, Gunnar is navigating. He cannot see the sun or stars, but he has been tracking the wind direction. Storms in this region typically blow from the southwest, and Gunnar uses this knowledge to maintain a sense of direction. Feel the wind on your face, he calls to Eric over the howl of the gale. Feel how it pushes. As long as the wind comes from the same quarter, we can keep our orientation. We adjust the sail, we angle the ship, we use the steering oar to hold our course against the wind and waves. He also watches the waves themselves. In a storm, wind-driven waves come predominantly from the direction the wind is blowing. But remember the deep swells Gunnar spoke of earlier? Even in a storm, those underlying swells maintain their direction, and an experienced navigator can feel the difference between the chaotic surface waves and the more regular, deeper motion. The ship moves in layers, Gunnar explains during a brief lull. The quick, short movements are from the storm waves, but there is a slower, deeper rhythm beneath that the old swell's still running. I feel that deeper rhythm through the hull, and it tells me we have not turned around, that we are still heading in the right direction. The Vikings also used drift anchors, floating sea anchors made from bundled cloth or leather, attached to a line and deployed from the bow. These devices helped hold the ship's heading into the waves, preventing it from being pushed sideways or turned broadside to the seas, which could lead to capsizing. Sometimes, Gunnar says, the only navigation in a storm is to survive it. You heave to, you ride it out, and when the storm passes, you take stock. You look at the sun or stars, you check your position as best you can, and you adjust your course accordingly. Every navigator gets lost sometimes. The skill is in finding yourself again. The storm passes after 2 days, and when the sun breaks through the clouds, Gunnar uses his shadow board to check their position. They have been pushed north of their intended track, but not dangerously so. He adjusts course to the southwest, and by evening, they are back on the proper latitude for Iceland. Landfall and recognition. On the 16th day, the unmistakable signs of approaching land begin to appear. The seabirds change more puffins, more gulls, the occasional cormorant. The watercolor shifts subtly, taking on a greener tinge. In the distance, clouds seem to hold stationary rather than moving with the wind clouds formed by air rising over land. Then, in the late afternoon, someone calls out, "Land ahead." At first, it is just a smudge on the horizon, a darkening that could almost be a cloud bank. But as they draw closer, it resolves into the unmistakable profile of mountains, their slopes still spotted with snow despite the summer season. Iceland, Gunnar says simply, satisfaction in his voice. We have made landfall exactly where I intended, near the Vestmannaeyjar, the Westman Islands, off the south coast. But the navigation is not finished. Now comes the final phase. coastal piloting, the detailed navigation required to find their specific destination along the coast. Gunnar has never been to this particular harbor before, but he has the sailing directions memorized. After passing the Westman Islands, he recites, "Sail east along the coast. You will see two headlands that look like a whale's back. Between them is a bay. At the eastern end of the bay is a river mouth. The settlement lies on the east bank of the river, on a flat area above the flood line. Look for the longhouse with a turf roof and a red-painted door." These incredibly specific directions, passed along through the network of Viking-age sailors, guide them to their destination. Each landmark is distinctive enough to be recognized, each instruction clear enough to be followed. This is navigation at its most detailed and local level. As they sail along the coast, Eric marvels at how the landscape matches his father's description. The whaleback headlands, the bay, the river mouth, all exactly as promised. By evening, they are pulling the ship up onto the beach beside the settlement, welcomed by the local inhabitants. They have crossed nearly 2,000 kilometers of open ocean, spending 16 days at sea, using no magnetic compass, no charts, no modern instruments. They navigated using the sun and stars, the patterns of waves, the behavior of birds, the color of water, and the accumulated wisdom of their seafaring culture. And they arrived exactly where they intended to go. The science behind the seamanship. As Gunnar and Eric settle in for the night at the Icelandic farmstead, warm by the fire and full from the evening meal, let us step back and examine what we have witnessed, not with the eyes of a 9th century navigator, but with modern scientific understanding. The Vikings navigated using what we might call a constellation of cues, multiple sources of information integrated into a coherent navigational picture. No single technique was foolproof, but together they provided redundancy and cross-checking that made reliable ocean navigation possible. Their celestial navigation, while lacking the mathematical precision of later European navigation, was based on sound astronomical principles. The sun's predictable path across the sky, the fixed position of Polaris relative to true north, the seasonal changes in solar rising and setting positions, all of these are real, measurable phenomena that could be observed and used without sophisticated instruments. The shadowboard technique for maintaining latitude is mathematically equivalent to measuring the sun's altitude at noon with a sextant. The tool just looked different and worked with shadows rather than angular measurements. Both methods accomplish the same goal, keeping the ship on a constant line of latitude. The use of wave patterns for navigation has been validated by studies of traditional Pacific Island navigators who use similar techniques. Ocean swells do indeed maintain consistent directions over long distances, and experienced navigators can distinguish between different swell systems and local wind waves. The biomechanical ability of humans to detect acceleration and orientation, our vestibular system, is sensitive enough to pick up the subtle differences in ship motion caused by swells from different directions. The sunstone hypothesis has been tested in laboratory conditions. Studies have shown that calcite crystals can indeed be used to determine solar direction under overcast skies by analyzing polarization patterns. The technique requires some skill and practice, but it is physically sound and could work as described in the sagas. The Vikings' use of birds for navigation has parallels in many seafaring cultures. Birds have different ranges and behaviors that provide reliable information about proximity to land. The raven release technique described in the sagas is essentially a biological version of a homing beacon. Even the more subtle cues, watercolor, floating vegetation, fish species, seafloor composition, all have scientific basis. These are real indicators of location and oceanic conditions that can be learned through experience and observation. What the Vikings had developed over generations of seafaring was a comprehensive system of natural navigation. It was not written down in the form of navigation manuals or academic treatises. It was transmitted orally, taught through apprenticeship, refined through experience. But it was no less sophisticated for being rooted in tradition rather than formal science. The network of knowledge. Beyond the individual techniques, we must understand that Viking navigation existed within a broader social and cultural context. Navigation was not the skill of isolated individuals, but of a community. Every successful voyage added to the collective knowledge. Sailing directions were shared in drinking halls and at assemblies. Navigators discussed currents and landmarks, compared experiences, refined their understanding. When a new route was discovered, such as when Eric the Red found Greenland, or when Leif Erikson reached Vinland, the navigational knowledge required to repeat those voyages was shared throughout the seafaring community. This collaborative approach to navigation meant that no single navigator needed to know everything. The sailing directions from Norway to Iceland were well established and widely known. The details of specific harbors along Iceland's coast might be known to specialists who frequented those areas. The routes through the dangerous waters around the Orkney Islands were the expertise of local pilots. When planning a voyage to an unfamiliar destination, a navigator would seek out those who had made the journey before. He would listen to their descriptions, memorize their landmarks, learn from their experiences. In this way, navigational knowledge spread and accumulated throughout the Viking world. The sagas preserve some of this knowledge-sharing culture. They tell of navigators who earned fame for their skills, of sailing directions given as gifts or exchanged for hospitality, of the respect accorded to those who could find their way across the northern seas, the limitations and losses. But we must also be honest about the limitations of Viking navigation and the extent of what has been lost to history. The Vikings sometimes got lost. The sagas record instances of ships disappearing at sea, of voyagers driven far off course by storms, of crews who set out never to be seen again. Navigation by natural means, however sophisticated, could not guarantee safe passage. The North Atlantic is a dangerous ocean, and the Viking Age longships, while seaworthy for their time, were small and vulnerable. Moreover, much of what we think we know about Viking navigation is actually reconstruction and inference rather than direct documentation. The Vikings left no navigation manuals. The detailed knowledge Gunnar teaches Eric in our story is a synthesis of archaeological evidence, saga descriptions, experimental archaeology, and comparison with other traditional navigation systems, particularly those of Pacific Island cultures, which were better documented when first encountered by European explorers. Some techniques are fairly certain. The use of celestial navigation, the maintenance of latitude, the recognition of landmarks, the use of sailing directions, these are well attested and uncontroversial. Others, like the sunstone, remain in the realm of strong possibility but cannot be definitively proven. Still, others may have existed but left no trace in the historical record. We also don't know how navigation techniques varied across the Viking world. Did Norwegian navigators use the same methods as Danish ones? Did techniques evolve over the 3 centuries of the Viking Age? Were there regional specializations or innovations? The answers to these questions are largely lost. What we can say with confidence is that the Vikings were capable ocean navigators who established and maintained routes across some of the most challenging waters in the world. And they did so without the navigational instruments that later European sailors considered essential. The transition to new methods. As Gunnar and Eric's journey comes to an end, it is worth considering what happened to these navigation techniques in the centuries that followed. The magnetic compass began to appear in European navigation around the 12th century, some 200 years after the end of the Viking Age. This Chinese invention, transmitted through the Islamic world to Europe, revolutionized navigation by providing a constant directional reference that worked day and night in any weather. Written charts also began to appear, first as simple coastal outlines, then with increasing sophistication. The Portolan charts of the 13th and 14th centuries marked a transition from oral to written navigation knowledge. As these new tools became available, the old techniques gradually faded. Why memorize the sun's seasonal positions when a compass points north regardless? Why develop an intimate knowledge of wave patterns when a chart shows depths and hazards? Why maintain oral sailing directions when written descriptions and charts could be copied and distributed? By the late medieval period, the navigational methods of the Vikings had largely been forgotten in Europe, replaced by new technologies. Ironically, traditional navigation methods persisted longer in some of the very regions the Vikings had settled. Icelandic and Faroese fishermen continued to use natural navigation techniques into the 20th century, long after compass and chart had become standard elsewhere. It was only in the 20th century, as scholars began to seriously investigate traditional navigation systems, prompted in part by Thor Heyerdahl's voyage on the Kon-Tiki raft and later by detailed studies of Pacific Island navigation, that interest in Viking Age navigation methods revived. Experimental archaeology projects, where replicas of Viking ships made ocean crossings using only period-appropriate navigation techniques, demonstrated that such voyages were indeed possible. The most famous of these experimental voyages was perhaps the 1,893 crossing of the Atlantic by the replica Viking ship, Viking, which sailed from Norway to Newfoundland for the Chicago World's Fair. More recent projects, such as the Sea Stallion from Glendalov's 2007 to 2008 voyage from Ireland to Denmark and back, have added to our understanding of what was possible with Viking Age technology and techniques. The lasting legacy. As we near the end of our journey, and as Gunnar and Eric rest peacefully in the Icelandic farmstead after their successful crossing, let us consider the legacy of Viking navigation. The immediate geographic legacy is clear. The Vikings discovered and settled Iceland, Greenland, and reached North America centuries before Columbus. They established trade routes that connected Scandinavia with Constantinople, navigated the rivers of Russia, and raided and traded throughout Europe. All of this required navigation, but there is a deeper legacy in the way the Vikings thought about the ocean and their relationship with it. They saw the sea not as an empty space to be crossed as quickly as possible, but as a place to be understood, read, and navigated through intimate knowledge of its characteristics. This perspective that the natural world is full of information that can be interpreted by those who learn to read it is something that modern navigation technology has largely displaced. We no longer need to watch the flight of birds or study the patterns of waves because GPS tells us exactly where we are. Yet there is value in understanding these older methods, not necessarily for practical navigation in the modern world, but as examples of human ingenuity and adaptation. The Vikings developed sophisticated solutions to complex problems using the materials and knowledge available to them. They created a working navigation system through careful observation of nature, patient transmission of knowledge across generations, and continual refinement through experience. Their methods remind us that technology is not the only path to solving problems, that deep environmental knowledge can substitute for instruments, and that human perception and memory are capable of remarkable feats when properly trained and applied. In an age when we increasingly delegate cognitive tasks to devices, when we follow GPS directions without maintaining awareness of our route, when we rely on weather apps rather than reading the sky, when we've lost many traditional skills and knowledge systems, the study of Viking navigation offers a counterexample. It shows that humans are capable of extraordinary navigational achievements using nothing but their senses, their minds, and accumulated cultural knowledge. The eternal ocean, the fire in the Icelandic longhouse, burns low. Outside, the summer night, which in these northern latitudes never quite becomes true darkness, holds the land in soft twilight. The sea, having carried Gunnar and Eric safely across its expanse, continues its eternal motion, waves rolling against the shore with patient rhythm. Somewhere out on that ocean, other ships are making their way through the darkness. Other navigators are reading the stars and waves, carrying on traditions stretching back generations. The knowledge flows like water, from father to son, from master to apprentice, from shore to shore. Tomorrow, Gunnar and Eric will begin the business that brought them to Iceland trading goods, meeting with the local chieftain, perhaps arranging a marriage alliance or settling a dispute. But tonight, they can rest with the satisfaction of a journey well made, of miles safely crossed, of ancient skills successfully applied. In another few weeks, they will make the return journey, and Eric will take a more active role in the navigation, beginning his own transformation from student to master. In years to come, he will make this crossing many times, will learn routes to other lands, will perhaps discover harbors and landmarks his father never saw. And when he has a son of his own, he will stand on a shore and point to the sky and sea, passing on the wisdom he inherited. This is how knowledge lives, not in books or instruments, but in people, in practice, in the doing and teaching and learning that stretches across generations. The Vikings left behind few written records of their navigation methods, but they left something more enduring, a tradition of seamanship, a culture of exploration, and the demonstration that human beings, working with nature rather than against it, can accomplish extraordinary things. The ocean that separates lands also connects them. The same water that touches the shores of Norway also washes Iceland, Greenland, and the coast of Vinland. The same stars that wheel above the North Atlantic guided sailors in the age of the Vikings and guide us still. The patterns of waves, the flight of birds, the motion of the sun, these have not changed. What has changed is us, our tools, our relationship with the natural world. But in studying how the Vikings navigated, we reconnect with an older way of being in the world, a way that relied on observation, memory, and intimate environmental knowledge. We see that sophisticated navigation did not begin with modern instruments, but with attentive human minds engaging deeply with their environment. The final lesson. As dawn breaks over Iceland, a gentle dawn, arriving slowly as it does in summer at these latitudes, Gunnar rises and walks down to the shore. The ship rests on the beach, secured and safe. Beyond it, the sea stretches toward the horizon, vast and mysterious as always. Eric joins his father, and they stand together in comfortable silence, watching the light grow on the water. "You have learned much on this journey," Gunnar finally says, "but there is one more thing I must tell you, the most important lesson of all." Eric waits, attentive. All the techniques I have shown you, the reading of stars, the interpretation of waves, the use of the shadow board, the observation of birds, these are tools. They are important and you must master them. But the true skill of navigation lies not in the tools, but in something deeper. He pauses, choosing his words carefully. It lies in humility before the sea, in knowing that you do not control the ocean, the wind, or the weather. In understanding that sometimes, despite all your skill and knowledge, you will be tested. The mark of a true navigator is not that he never gets lost, but that he keeps his head when he does, that he adapts to changing conditions, that he respects the power of nature while not being paralyzed by fear of it. Gunnar looks at his son. The ocean has killed many good men, many skilled navigators. It will continue to do so. We reduce the risk through knowledge and skill, but we can never eliminate it. Every time we sail beyond sight of land, we place ourselves in the hands of fate. But you still sail, Eric says. I still sail, Gunnar agrees, because the ocean is also beautiful, because there are lands to discover and trade routes to maintain, because I am a navigator, and this is what navigators do. We accept the risks because the rewards, the knowledge, the adventure, the connections between distant shores are worth it. He places a hand on Eric's shoulder. When you are older and have made many voyages, people will ask you the secret of navigation. Tell them this: there is no secret. There is only patience to learn, discipline to practice, wisdom to know your limitations, and courage to venture beyond the horizon despite uncertainty. These qualities made navigators of our ancestors. They will make a navigator of you. The sun rises higher, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink. Somewhere out on the ocean, invisible from shore, a ship makes its way through the dawn, its crew using the ancient arts to find their path across the water. The Vikings' true navigation methods were not magic or mystery. They were the product of careful observation, transmitted knowledge, practical experience, and respect for the natural world. They allowed a seafaring people to expand across the North Atlantic, to discover new lands, and to establish connections that shaped medieval history. Today, we navigate differently, with technologies the Vikings could not have imagined. But we can still learn from their methods, not as practical techniques for modern sailing, but as examples of human adaptation and ingenuity. They show us that sophisticated problem-solving does not require sophisticated technology, that deep knowledge of the environment can substitute for instruments, and that traditions of skill and wisdom, carefully maintained across generations, are a form of cultural wealth as valuable as any physical treasure. As the day breaks fully and the world comes alive with the sounds and activities of morning, as Gunnar and Eric turn back toward the longhouse for breakfast and the continuation of their Icelandic sojourn, the lessons of their voyage remain. That the journey is as important as the destination, that knowledge is a living thing passed from person to person, and that the skills of the past, while seemingly superseded by modern technology, still hold value for those willing to look deeply into how our ancestors understood and interacted with their world. Epilogue. The endless voyage. Close your eyes now, and let your breathing slow to match the rhythm of ocean waves. Imagine yourself on the deck of a longship, feeling the gentle rise and fall as swells pass beneath the hull. The sail curves above you, full of wind. The sun tracks across a blue sky, and somewhere ahead beyond the horizon, but drawing steadily nearer, lies your destination. You are a navigator, heir to centuries of accumulated wisdom. You know the stars and sun. You can read the language of waves. You understand the messages carried by birds and watercolor. In your mind, you hold maps not drawn on parchment but woven from experience, story, and observation. The ocean stretches endless in all directions, yet you are not lost. You know where you are and where you are going. You navigate not by fighting against nature, but by understanding and working with it, by reading the signs that nature provides to those who know how to look. This is the gift the Vikings left us. Not just the discovery of new lands or the establishment of trade routes, but a demonstration of what humans can accomplish through patient observation, transmitted wisdom, and respectful engagement with the natural world. Their navigation methods, while specific to their time and place, embody universal principles of learning, adaptation, and skillful interaction with environment. As you drift now towards sleep, let yourself imagine that you are making a crossing not across the Atlantic, but across the gentler ocean of night, navigating from wakefulness to dreams. The techniques are not so different. You let go of the need to control. You trust in processes larger than yourself. You follow natural rhythms. You allow yourself to be carried. The ship rocks gently. The stars wheel overhead in their eternal patterns. The sea whispers its ancient songs. And you, navigator of the boundary between wake and sleep, between present and past, between the known and unknown, make your crossing in safety, guided by the wisdom of those who came before and the patterns of nature that endure unchanged. Sleep well, traveler. The ocean is vast, but the way is known. The voyage continues as it always has, as it always will, across the eternal seas under the patient stars. And in the morning, when you wake to a new day, you will carry with you the memory of this journey, this voyage through history and story, through technique and tradition, through the misty northern seas where the Vikings once sailed, masters of navigation, readers of nature, and explorers of the unknown. The story ends, as all stories must, but the ocean continues forever.